Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar. What's this? The wrong heading to the webinar over here. Don't know how that happened. We are looking at family management, specifically the following agenda. How do we do family library management? Downloading and purging versus modeling up families, upgrading families. The read-only BIM Managers Library or the corporate library, editable project library, library reconciliation or family reconciliation, and then questions. As we go along, if you have any questions, remember to type them into the chat box or to break into the conversation at any time. You're most welcome. There we go. All right, so first of all, the family library management is central to any project, whether it's Revit, any other BIM platform, AutoCAD. There's always content. There may be blocks, there may be Revit families, there could be inventor components, whatever it is that is being used in the project. There will be some or other managerial role to make sure that our families and the data that they transmit are correct and that we get the right fidelity from them. So with that in mind, I am going to focus on Revit this morning, simply because I think many of us use Revit, and at the same time it serves as an illustration of a method or a culture that is applicable to any piece of software and library, and also will be one of the most developed standards worldwide, which is the UK standard. Of course, in South Africa, our BIM standards are not already at that level of the UK. So they've got lots of interesting and intelligent people in the United Kingdom that apply their minds on behalf of their government as well as on behalf of industry to make sure that their resources in their country is geared towards giving them savings and compatibility between companies, individuals, and whoever uses their standards. And central to this is somebody that is typically referred to as the BIM manager. Now, while this is a general term that many of us know, it's not always the BIM manager who manages the family. It could be, but there are many roles within a project. But we'll refer to the BIM manager in this case, especially for our smaller architects. You'll find that the BIM manager takes on the responsibility of many roles, and we'll refer to them as the BIM manager. So the BIM manager is the person that's ultimately responsible to make sure that the family library management proceeds as required. And it's also the person that they are also the person that educates the BIM authors. So if you're not familiar with the term, we refer to BIM modelers or draftspeople, as some would refer to them. In the BIM world, we refer to them as BIM authors. And it's the BIM manager's role to teach the BIM authors about the family creation and management. And it's also their responsibility to troubleshoot when something goes wrong. So in a project, there's deadlines, there's a lot of pressure and time pressure, and having somebody that understands the families intimately is important because they can then solve any issues that crop up. And then later on, the reconciliation of the family library with projects or with reject families. So you either have to, I'll explain this in a moment, but when you work on a project, you're not working on the company or the corporate library. You basically copy the corporate library to the project, and then those families get modified. They might be positive changes, or they might be changes that impact the project negatively. And it is also the BIM manager's role to make that call and to say, look, you've made a wonderful change to our family, and it's going to work so beautifully within the next project. And for that reason, I'm going to adopt your family, and I'm going to say that we are going to use this family going forward in a specific way. Or if a family has caused trouble during a project, then we might say, look, we're going to reject this family. However, if we manage it in a different manner, then we can maybe make some changes to it and include it in a different next project to test it, and then ultimately adopt it into our corporate family database. Okay, and then very importantly also is the data generated by the families. So data can take many forms. Typically what our production processes would be interested in would be schedules, how much of what there is, but it goes much further than that, because the embedded data within families map onto further downstream, where the design models are used during construction, and then ultimately in facilities management, where the metadata that is attached to the families are used. This works for clash detection, and it's used in online platforms, maybe even ported through into an IFC format to help with facilities or FM management. And that then is used for maintenance purposes. And that's very important going forward internationally. With 5G, we're going to have lots of transducers within buildings so that we can do things like monitoring of electricity and water. And by recognizing that there are anomalies, we can then do maintenance on equipment so that that is all good. So even that streaming of data and monitoring the data that is generated by the building can facilitate things like saving on maintenance, as well as informing authorities on what sort of infrastructure will be required going into the future. So if we put up a skyscraper, then based on historical data for a specific building, how many extra lanes must the highway have, how much extra water piping must be laid on, etc., etc. So that is very important, and that sort of metadata can also be included by the family. So how much power is the component supposed to have, what sort of power curve can we expect over its lifetime, and if it exceeds that value, then we need to flag it. And that's the kind of idea behind it. Then we've got the BIM author. That's typically you or me or somebody else that's working on a project. We're drawing up the components, we're placing the components within the model, we are applying materials and finishes. And what is our role? Well, this is debatable, but common consensus amongst BIM consultants in South Africa and worldwide is that BIM authors should have the ability to manage their own families in the projects as they author. So you shouldn't have to go to your BIM manager to ask, can you please model up a table for me, or a chair, or an HVAC component, or a light fitting. Whatever family you are using or whatever component you are designing, you are supposed to know how to model that up. Or if the geometry is too complex or already exists in the library or in a different library, maybe online, when you download that family, how do you inspect that family? How do you change the family? How do you purge the family? How do you make that family compliant or with your standards so that you can use that in your project? Some companies believe that there should be one person to model up the families. In reality, what you'll find is that the power users of Revit are typically architects, and they give a bit of resistance to this. And they say, look, it's not my job to model up families. My job is to design the building. And this is true. But if they do need to model up the family, they should be able to do that for themselves. Interns and lower skilled Revit users should be trained up in the skills that they need to create these families, and that is critical. And if I might just say also, Micrographics does offer a family modeling course. Depending on what discipline you're from, you will need different skills. So that process of vetting and purging families is very important. You'll see in a moment when we discuss this further what we mean by that. And then you need to communicate also effectively with the BIM manager and information manager. As an aside, I've read recently about the managerial culture within Tesla with Elon Musk, where he does not believe in a corporate structure around him. He wants anybody within his organization to contribute ideas towards the project. And I personally believe that in a production environment, it's critical that the right information can get to the right person. When one teaches classes like I do, I've learned that everybody has valid questions to ask, and that those questions, although some people think, oh, I shouldn't ask a question because maybe it's stupid, there's no such thing as a stupid question. And sometimes it's the people that know the least that ask the most important question. So it's important that anybody can communicate effectively with the structure, the corporate structure around them, to get the information to the people that need to hear the information, and then also so that the project can proceed as good as possible. So communication, like anything in life, is key, and respect for each other and each other's roles as well. This will give you, this is, the modern way of thinking about it is a little bit different from this, but it does illustrate it very well. This is taken from the UK standard, which preceded the ISO 19650 standard, which is being adopted worldwide now. But just to illustrate that there are roles and responsibilities and authority within a supply chain and between the supply chain and the employer, and that you have this system. So usually the family management will happen within this box over here within a task team. But they say task team really means, to us who's familiar with this silo, so it might be the structural engineer, the MEP consultant, the architect, the interior designer. That would constitute the task team. And then you have your task team managers, and then inside here your BIM authors. You also have your task information managers and your interface managers. But so let's look at this from our perspective. So the BIM manager would typically be the task team manager. They'll have certain roles and responsibilities for this team. The BIM authors are the people that then model up the building or the asset, the built asset. They are really responsible for the families. The BIM manager is more concerned with how do we manage the families. And then we've got the task information managers. So there's so much information that gets generated when modeling up a project, especially if it goes further onto something like a COBE deliverable, which is in essence a standard that is used globally for facilities maintenance. Then we need other disciplines or other people involved with the project. They might never model anything within Revit or a CAD or any sort of drafting package. But the task information managers will make sure that, for instance, maintenance schedules are updated, warranties, you installed the component. All of that information is fed into a modern built asset or an asset information model. And so each person within this team really should have their roles and responsibilities. That said, a person might have to take on more than one role. So if you're a one-man band and you want to learn this process or you want to understand this process, or if you're a small team where you don't have somebody to fulfill each one of these roles, then you could always assume both the role of the task team manager and a BIM author and task information manager, But in that sense, you should still try and differentiate your tasks to understand which role you are busy with when you perform a specific action, because then you'll understand your role within a larger context globally about how it is that built assets are managed or produced. So let's look at something called family creation. So downloading and purging versus modeling. It's very easy to go and download families. I'll illustrate that for you as an example with various websites. We're going to have a quick look at MagicCAD, Cloud, BIMobject.com, Revit City, and SketchUp Texture Club. Remember, things like materials are also important, as is the metadata. But SketchUp, I think Texture Club, it's nice just because it's got some nice pictures that we can look at. Let's just have a look at this. Here's BIMobject.com. This is an interesting website because we've got lots and lots of families in here. If we were looking at, say, for argument's sake, chairs, there we can find that there are many chairs that come up. Now these are three-dimensional models that would look great in an office. However, is this family fit for purpose? And the answer to that is maybe and maybe not, but we should have a look at that in any case. What's nice about BIM Object is its manufacturer's content, so you can also have a look at the brands. There's lots of brands that you can choose from, and you can even in your filter here, you can even go by country. So if you want to have a look, say most of us, I suspect, are from South Africa, but you can even have a look at South Africa for argument's sake. I think we should be somewhere over here. There's South Africa. And this should show you 812 products that you're able to buy from a specific manufacturer within the country that you are designing in. So that just makes your job easier. MagicCAD Cloud is also interesting. This is for the MEP guys. If there are MEP guys over here, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing, it is a European library, but a lot of these brands are available online with their components that you can download. And again, some of them would be available within our market area, which we could search. And sometimes they put us under the Republic of South Africa, but let's just see, there's South Africa. So under South Africa, you would then see that the content that's available to us once it's done its search. But mostly European based, but there you can see there's quite a bit that comes up here. There's MagicCAD Cloud. There's over 1 million BIM objects from 290 manufacturers, and there's various different applications that you can download them for. Not only Revit, but other components as well. It makes it easy for us when we design our models, just to, instead of modeling it up ourselves, we can download these files. Ectolic is another one that's MEP based. It's situated right next to New York, and they've got wonderful components that even have their own software that interfaces with other people's software, and they also go into fabrication. So in Revit, at least, we've got these fabrication parts that we can adapt to the MEP components, and that maps directly onto the manufacturer's machines, which means that they can manufacture the content that you see on your screen there very easily. We've got Revit City. So I've used Revit City before, and it's wonderful if you just want to get an idea across, but this is not necessarily manufacturer's content. So it's, it's not necessarily the manufacturer that released it. Let's have a look at something like Bosch. So I know Bosch, there's a few models that you can see. There's a gas hob, there's a stove, and I know there's some fridges and all sorts of things that we can have a look at. Lots of models over here that you can download, but again, they might not be commercially available, but at least from a design perspective or from a concept perspective, you can get that across to whoever needs to get that. And then lastly, the materials. So especially for architects and for interior designers, the look and the feel of the materials, the texture is very important. And over here we've got the textures from Texture, SketchUp, Texture Club. And all of these websites are free to some extent if you just create a login and you can download. So there might be some limited downloads that you can do per day, or maybe not such high resolution unless you pay for it. But it's got some wonderful, wonderful, wonderful textures over here. So you can create any sort of roof that you want. These are shingles, and then you can see there's some metal and some metal roofs, and you can even see some thatched textures. So this is a great resource. It's not the only resource online, of course, but it's one that I found to have some great textures. We use this in Lumion as well, do some great renderings, and wonderful resource if you just want to create material texture. Of course, the rest of the material, things like your mechanical and thermal properties, that's more scientifically based, but should also be managed within this process so that you get the correct metadata through to the engineers and to other third-party applications that then leverage things like, for argument's sake, the yield strengths and the Young's moduli, thermal resistance and capacitance of materials. All of those have an influence on analysis software for the model. So there's lots of stuff online that you can go and have a look at and download to make your life easier. Then data can be an issue, especially shared parameters. So I've come across this multiple times, both within national retailers and within large international hospital projects, where the production line doesn't really understand shared parameters. So they just download a family, and by coincidence, the family has a shared parameter in it, where it's got exactly the same name as a shared parameter that's already used in the project, and unfortunately each one of those shared parameters have their own global unique identifier. And then what happens is the information gets scheduled independently of each other, even though it's got the same name. So there's one example of how something within Revit, at least, plays a huge role about why you should not just download a family and throw it into a project. First, you must go and have a look at what shared parameters are in that project. Do they have the same name as the shared parameters that you're using in your project? If they do, can you replace them with the shared parameter that you need to specify? If not, can you get some other workaround? So just that on its own. Then the appearance and the level of detail is also an issue. So just to give you an indication of what we're talking about here. Within a project, we typically start out at the beginning of a project. When we roll out the BIM protocol, we say to people, listen, this is what the standard that we're working to, in this case the Uniform at 2015, which is usually the 2010 is the sort of watered, or the earlier version, the less expanded version. It's maybe better for illustrative purposes. But here we can see that the standard that's getting followed, we've got our substructure, our shell, going through to our interiors and our services and equipment and furnishings and so on and so forth. And each one of those has a code attached to it. And what we do at the beginning, so think about it, right? The substructure might typically be the structural engineer. The shell, that will typically be the architect. The interiors, that's either an interior architect or interior designer. Then we've got our services, our MEP engineers, our fire engineers, and so on. And so we go on. So typically each one of these categories or main categories is applicable to one part of the production or to the supply chain. And so we say, for instance, that the level of development during our conceptual design must be of a certain level of development. So what is that? The level of development specification, here's an example. You can see it's really coming from a bit old. But this now shows you exactly how you are supposed to model an item. Let's take something like because a picture tells 1,000 words. Here's an example for argument's sake, a pneumatic tube. So this might be a 100, just a diagrammatic element, okay? And then we go on to generic elements, so something that represents it. And then we can go modeled as design specified requirements. So there we refine it further, and then ultimately maybe we show where it is connected. And then there we start adding the field installation, fabrication, and the rest of the information that's required, all the detailed drawings, the bolts and the nuts of it. So this number over here, 200 for instance, that says a generic element, to us what that will mean is that at the beginning of the project we're not sure exactly what it's going to look like, but we know that we need it. So until we know what we want, we're going to say we just require 200. And then during the detailed design, we might say 300 is sufficient, or we might go further on to 350 or 400. And then during the design, during the construction phase, there is our final level of development that we need for that family. The MEA stands for the person that is responsible for modeling the component. So typically that's a company. So the wall foundations is the responsibility of the structural engineer. The ramps might, typically it is a structural engineer, it might be the architect. But as we go further down, we can see, all right, so here we get to the interiors. Now it starts becoming the architect's responsibility. So for each code, we've got somebody or company that's responsible for the family during the design phase of the project. And that's very important because now already we understand that, oh, I'm an architect, so I must have doors, and therefore I must model my doors in a specific way during different parts of the project. And the management of these families are important. Where it becomes critical is with the MEP services, because when you switch out a family, the families disconnect from their systems. So we usually ask the BIM managers to accept a final grade for MEP families because we don't want them to disconnect from their systems. That is down to management. But why would you want something like that? Because if you had to do, say, a preliminary rendering of a room and you find that you've used a kind of placeholder family for chairs or interior walls or whatever, then you can switch the families out. You can say park a model parallel to your model in time, and you say, I'm going to model this part of the building. You isolate that part of the building, and then you switch out the families into a more developed family just to get that visual representation back at you. And there's an example of where you might use this. But if you have to do that on a large project, of course, it's going to increase the size of the project to such an extent that it's going to become unusable in certain cases, depending on how much rendering you want to do. So that's an example of the level of development. So when you say that the level of development or of appearance and the level of detail and development is important, that can also be an issue. You can see now that it's easy to download families, and family modeling is a skill and should be taught to each person that models, because they should have freedom to create their own families. They should have the freedom to associate these families with their project, but they should also be done in a specific manner. And therefore, it's important also that people require training to understand how they must. It's like going out into the public and wearing a mask to protect other people. That's just good manners, in my opinion. But if that is the rules of the country, then that is what we need to comply to, and that is what we do. So if we model families, it's the same idea. We need to model these families in a very specific manner so that we fit into the culture of the project. Basic mathematical skills are necessary to model typical families. So your architectural families, for instance, especially if they are parametric, you might need to create some reference planes and some lines to constrain the geometry so you can duplicate the families to different sizes, and they adjust their geometry accordingly. That's relatively easy, depending on the component. But once we get to things like MEP, pipe, and duct fittings, that becomes much more complex. So there, one would sort of expect the person to have the mathematical abilities of a matric student or a first-year engineering student. And they would be able to model up all these families without much hassle. Right? So depending on the family that you model up, you also need some or other level of skill so that you can at least do the mathematics, the logic behind the family, put in the correct lookup tables and into the correct formulae and so on. So the person that's responsible for modeling up these families in the project should at least have the basic skills that's required over and above the modeling, because there is logic. We also find that from one year to the next, we might need to upgrade the families. It's like a piece of software. It's rewritten for every new year, and then maybe you have an add-in to your software, and so that the developer will adjust their families to the new version. And it's important to vet these families from year to year. So at least in Revit we can automate this. There are some add-ins that do this, or you can load all the families into the project, although that might be very large, depending on the size of your family library. And you can upgrade the project, or depending on what software you come from, there's different ways that you can go about this, but it's important to make sure that your content from one year is compliant or compatible with the next year's project, because, well, let me give you an example. Somebody forgot to audit their model from one year to the next, carried on designing and designing and designing, and then eventually when they did the audit, they lost a third of their building. So you don't want to get into a situation like that. So you just want to make sure you do the required maintenance on the families, and you make sure that they can carry on into the future as you develop that library and maintain it. Very importantly, the read-only BIM corporate family library. That's what I call it. It's got different names depending on who you talk to. But it's the reference library. So if you go to a library at a university and you go to the reference section, or even just to a local municipal library, and if you take for argument's sake, the dictionaries or the encyclopedias, then you take them to the counter and you say, I'd like to take this book home. And they say, no, you can't, because everybody needs access to it and so on. So that idea is the same over here. You shouldn't be editing the BIM corporate family library. So we make it read-only. You can download stuff from there, but you can't edit it. It's the responsibility of the BIM manager to decide whether a family that might have been modified, downloaded, added, generated, whatever, during the project must be incorporated into a corporate BIM library. And that's what we do. So for every new project, we give the users access to the library. And so you can download any family from our corporate library, use in your project. You can also download, depending on the culture, you can download families from the internet and make sure that you make them compliant to our library. We'll do the reconciliation afterwards and decide whether it's applicable to our library, and then we'll incorporate that into our library if it is indeed compliant with our culture in our corporation, or whatever it is. And that's the sort of idea behind it. So you should have enough freedom within your project to do what you want, but you shouldn't have the freedom to adjust the corporate culture. And you should be operating according to certain standards that make you acceptable to the culture around you, the BIM culture around you. That's what the next few points are about. It's basically a free-for-all. If you go into production environment and you're under time pressure and one guy's asleep and other guy's awake, but you need a family, so do you go and wake him up at 2 o'clock in the morning? No, you don't. You just go and model that for yourself and put him in the library and so on and so forth. At the end of the project, you need to go and see, all right, can we use that family? Is the family fit for purpose? And then, of course, the BIM manager troubleshoots during the project and says, all right, you've used this family now, there's a problem with it, let me fix it for you, and then they fix it, and then afterwards, then maybe it's more compliant. You know? That's the collaborative environment, but in a project itself, you've got so much freedom, but it doesn't mean that you're going to put it into the company BIM protocols. So separate the two. And then, of course, it offers a great learning experience. So for anybody that's involved in a project like that, you can learn from what other people are doing. Other people know things that you don't know. You know things that other people don't know. You talk to each other, exchange ideas and information, and techniques, and so on. And you learn from that and become a better team because of that. I've included some links over there. If you do want to jot them down, or if you just want to remember them. Of course, the screen will be available in the recording afterwards. The BIMobject.com, MagicCAD, Revit City, Pictolic, SketchUp Texture Club. Those are some of the ones that I can think of. There's lots of other sorts of families that you can download, or components you can download, details, hatch patterns, pack files for AutoCAD. There's so much information out there. Just be careful. There are also things like macros that can help you to achieve certain things, and whatever it is on the internet, just always make sure that you do put it through a virus checker, because especially with scripts and things like that, you might find that it's that there might be viruses in it. Typically within the construction industry and within the design industry, it's not a belligerent environment and people help each other. So we don't, I personally, in the last 6 to 10 years that I've been involved, I haven't come across a situation where there's been a belligerent action when a virus was introduced that impeded my production line's work there, but you might be familiar with that. So also important to that is use the correct software, don't use cracked versions, and not only from an audit perspective, but also from a technology perspective, because what you generate might not be acceptable within a library. And so, just use your common sense and say, look, this is what we need to do in this manner. And then if you do need help with that, you can always contact us at Micrographics. We've got offices in Cape Town and Port Elizabeth, Johannesburg and Durban. Although with the new, especially with COVID and the way that we've learned how to work, we can do so remotely, and we can support you even though it's across the world. If it's in Australia even, or if it's a distributed team, we've got all the technology and the know-how, regardless of whether you're manufacturing or architecture, to help you across the world. So I hope, maybe just one more thing. Just think about the way that you name something, and I think this was the first idea that came through on the cover of the presentation. So over here you can see something that says role, classification, unit class, description, unit class, origin or manufacturer, the size, presentation, the grade, the level of detail. So all of these has a specific meaning, and so where it fits into the process is that you might have a building that's getting planned, and then for the object naming over here, you would specify a standard that you're going to use to name that. So you can see this in yellow over there. That's be compliant to PS 1192/2007. That's the UK standard. This is an example that's taken from a building in the Middle East. So typically you'll find that they would put together a list like this and say, right, when you name your families, you must name them in a specific way, both compliant to this British standard and that British standard. But maybe if you get to QC and QA, you might even find that they throw another standard in here because that's what's going to happen. Maybe the people that does this is based in Singapore, and so they must be able to do QC and do quality assurance and quality checking based on Singapore guidelines too. So, but at least with the naming of families, make sure in the project that you get involved in, how must it be named, because even the naming of your families must be managed. And there you might have somebody like a programmer or information manager that renames the families appropriately. And when, if you go into a project, this might not be the greatest example because not all of my families are named as such, but here you can see an example of what that family naming would look like. So here are some walls, for instance. starts out with a discipline. In this case, it's applicable to any discipline, but if it's AX, it means it's for architectural guys. There's the code of the family, and there's the description of the family, exactly like it is from the standard. And then who's the creator, what's the size. It's a model element, so that's the M, and then it's a G3, which means it's a 300 level of development. So that's what it ends up looking like in a piece of software ultimately. So even the naming of these families, that's also important. And this would typically be set out into something like a corporate BIM protocol, which this is, and which states to anybody entering the company at the beginning, this is how we're going to name our families, and this is, and then per project, that might be different because you might be doing a project in England one week, and you might be doing a project in Australia the other week, New Zealand, or Canada, China, or Russia, or even in countries where they use different languages, and we see that with some of our clients as well, that they even have to translate. And so, there's so much opportunity for not just job creation, but also diligence with regards to being able to communicate your design to whatever culture, area, place in the world that you're operating in, and that's very useful. So your components or your family libraries, that's very important, and something that you should pay close attention to. So that's really the webinar for today. I thank you for your time and for your interest. And if you guys have any questions, please direct them to us at Micrographics. We will be posting this on our website, a recording of the webinar, and you guys are welcome to watch that or refer other people to it. And it's time for questions now, so you're welcome to ask questions or contribute as well your experience and knowledge to the conversation. I don't know if you guys have any questions to what we just chatted about. I'm not seeing anything come through, but if you guys do want to chat about this later on, you've got our email addresses. Please just contact us, and if you need any training or assistance, or you'd like to contact us to help you with that, then please contact us. Okay, we're going to call it then. Thanks very much for your once again, and then have a great day.